They were the faces that sold magazines and filled theaters, glamorous, photogenic, and adored by millions. Yet, for critics, they were proof the studio system could sell stardom without the single thing people usually expect: convincing performances. This is the story of 9 Golden Age celebrities who were famous for everything except acting. It's a story about image, appetite, and a machine that could turn a photogenic blank into box office gold. But it's also about pressure, reinvention, and the human cost of being beautiful on demand. How did Hollywood pull this off? Why did audiences keep buying tickets when critics called the work hollow? And what happened to the people behind the press photos when the cameras finally stopped rolling? Let's meet them. And along the way, watch how a brilliant advertising apparatus turned even the most fragile performance into myth. Jane Mansfield, the publicity nuclear option. Imagine January 1957. The lights pop, flashbulbs bloom, and a pink Cadillac eases out of the crowd. Jane Mansfield steps onto the sidewalk in a dress so tight it reads like a headline. Photographers scramble. Gossip columns glow. Meanwhile, critics are already sharpening their knives. Reviewers didn't miss much. Mansfield's acting was called loud, shallow, and phonetically correct, an exercise in mimicry rather than feeling. Variety said watching her perform was like watching someone read in a language they didn't understand. But to the studios that promoted her, those criticisms were beside the point. Mansfield's career was the textbook example of a publicity engine. Directors would demonstrate lines and gestures, she'd mimic them. Editors would splice reaction shots to manufacture emotion. That acting might not survive scrutiny, but the image did. Wardrobe accidents choreographed for maximum scandal, a heart-shaped swimming pool photograph to sell a persona, and carefully timed appearances that made the gossip pages forget the reviews. She earned huge sums, dated powerful people, and when she died, tragically young, her legend only grew. Critics still called out her limitations, but Mansfield's story shows the essential calculation behind studio stardom. Spectacle could be more valuable than craft. Tab Hunter, the perfect face with a private price. Tab Hunter had the look studios dreamed of: athletic blonde and clean-cut, a face that made posters and team magazines. Directors' notes were simple: react, don't act. For the public, that was enough. For critics, it wasn't. Reviewers dismissed his work as wooden. Bosley Crowther of the New York Times compared him to a handsome mannequin. What critics sensed, and what the public didn't always see, was that Hunter was performing off-screen as well as on it. Decades later, Hunter's candid revelations about living closeted in the industry reframed his public persona. He admitted the daily act of pretending to be someone he wasn't was exhausting. The performance, in a sense, never stopped. There's a cruel logic here. Rivera, the public will buy the fantasy of a heartthrob even if the performance feels shallow. But the price is personal. Hunter's life illustrates how the studio's demand for an image could force an actor to live a second role, one that sometimes ate into the first. Mamie Van Doren, when the assembly line shows its seams. After Marilyn and Mansfield, studios wanted more blondes, fast. Mamie Van Doren was the result of that calculation. Measurements, angles, and a publicity playbook. Universal executives didn't hide it. They admitted they needed someone to fill the camera's sweet spots rather than deliver nuanced performances. Directors solved the problem with simple tricks. Give Van Doren a single line, cut to another actor's reaction, return with a different camera angle. Keep the camera moving. Never hold on a moment that might expose weakness. In exploitation pictures and quick genre films, that method worked well enough to make money while critics fumed. Van Doren became the textbook example used by reviewers to indict the studio system. If beauty could be factory-produced, what did that say about artistic standards? Yet, the studio didn't aim for art, it aimed for ticket sales. Van Doren's career made clear the trade. Profitability often outranked credibility. John Derek, the still face that learned to craft others' beauty. John Derek had the classically handsome profile studios adored, chiseled features designed for magazine covers. But on camera, his expression barely changed. Critics called him wooden, and co-stars joked his face showed every emotion as the same brooding glance. Still, Columbia poured money into promoting him. Derek wound up in big productions and glossy photo shoots because the industry sells faces as commodities. When his leading man prospects faded, Derek reinvented himself. He became a director and photographer, specializing in films and images built around his wife's beauty, most famously Bo Derek. It's an ironic arc. A man who couldn't convey inner life with his own face learned how to stage it in others. Derek's pivot shows another studio truth: image could be repurposed. If you couldn't act your way into complexity, you could orchestrate it in someone else's gaze. Tony Curtis, miscast then redeemed. Tony Curtis arrived in Hollywood with looks, energy, and a Bronx accent that would betray him in exotic roles. Critics laughed when he tried Shakespeare or played a prince in period pieces, and his Brooklyn vowels in ancient deserts became a running joke. But Curtis refused to be the cautionary tale permanently. He trained. He hired voice coaches, studied with acting teachers, and spent time on sets absorbing technique. Gradually, his work deepened. By the late 1950s, he'd turned in a searing performance in Sweet Smell of Success and earned an Academy Award nomination for The Defiant Ones. Curtis's story breaks the pattern. It's a reminder that the industry's initial labels aren't immutable. Sometimes pretty faces sharpen into real craft when someone chooses to do the hard work. His redemption also highlights how much first impressions can last. Critics never entirely forgot his earlier missteps, but it proves reinvention was possible. Hedy Lamarr, genius misread as glamour. Hedy Lamarr looked like a living masterpiece, so much so that studios crowned her the most beautiful woman in the world. But beauty hid something else, a remarkably inventive mind. During World War II, Lamarr co-developed a frequency-hopping technology designed to make torpedoes harder to jam, a precursor to modern wireless communication. On screen, she behaved like a precise, methodical person who treated performance as problem-solving. Directors and critics misinterpreted that approach as coldness or detachment. The studio's answer was to reduce her lines and amplify moments where the camera could simply capture her presence. Lamarr's intellect was invisible to an industry that preferred the easiest, most photogenic commodity. Her later bitterness, "Any girl can be glamorous. All you have to do is stand still and look stupid," underscores the tragedy. The system prized a static, decorative beauty while missing the extraordinary mind behind it. Lamarr's legacy reminds us that the industry often values the surface and overlooks substantive worth. Sonny Tufts, from promising to punchline. Sonny Tufts entered Hollywood at a moment of need. With many leading men in military service, studios were desperate for fresh faces. Tufts looked the part and came with pedigree. Early notices called him a discovery, but impressions shifted fast. His name became a shorthand joke for inept acting on radio shows and in cartoons. The downfall was swift and public. Drinking worsened his already wooden performances. Directors started to avoid complexity when casting him, and eventually the studio released him. Tufts's rapid fall shows a vulnerability in the image economy. Novelty attracts attention, but without something that feels authentic, audiences and critics tire quickly. It's a cautionary note about the limits of publicity. The machine can push someone up quickly, but it can also let them fall harder when reality or ridicule catches up. Dolores Hart, leaving the camera for a different calling. Dolores Hart's arc is one of the most surprising. She co-starred with Elvis, earned early critical attention, and seemed set for stardom. But behind the glamour, some critics noticed a puzzling calm in her performances, an inner life that didn't translate to the kinds of emotive beat studios wanted. At 24, after a string of films and a Tony nomination, Hart walked away from Hollywood to enter a Benedictine abbey. The choice stunned Tinseltown, but it also reframed what success looks like. For Hart, the camera was a chapter, not the whole story. Her departure complicates the narrative. Not every actor whose work felt muted was damaged by the system. Sometimes the system's expectations simply didn't match an individual's deeper calling. Hart's life, reminds us that acting demands a certain outward expressiveness and that a person's temperament might be more suited to another kind of life entirely. George Nader, promotional persistence meets public skepticism. Universal pushed George Nader hard. He had the squared jaw and the film-favored profile the studio liked. They promoted him as a future leading man. Critics, however, kept returning to the same complaint. Nader photographed well, but couldn't summon believable inner life. Reviews called him dead-eyed and unconvincing when scenes demanded emotional complexity. The studio's response was to double down, place him in action-heavy roles, put him in films where physical presence mattered more than subtlety, and keep him in the public eye. When that didn't elevate him into stardom, the industry shifted him toward lower-pressure markets where his particular qualities fit the parts. Eventually, he found a niche in European thrillers where the expectations and critical bar were different. Nader's path shows how studios sometimes refuse to abandon an investment even when it's plainly underperforming. It also suggests a quieter truth. Bad acting can be a function of mismatch and context. In the right environment, a limited emotional range can become serviceable. Across these 9 stories, a pattern emerges. The studio system was a machine built to sell fantasy efficiently. The components were simple: star looks, stage publicity, strategic editing, and a public hungry for glamour. Acting mattered when it delivered return on investment, but if a face could sell, a studio would find a way to protect and promote it. That doesn't vindicate wooden performances. Critics were often right to call out inert delivery and shallow reaction. But it does change how we evaluate those films. Many moviegoers didn't go to be convinced an actor was truly broken-hearted. They went to be given an idol to adore, a fantasy to slip into. Studios learned how to manufacture and monetize that experience. Some actors pushed back or evolved. Tony Curtis trained, studied, and became better. Hedy Lamar's ingenuity earned a very different form of recognition long after studios had reduced her to a glossy photo. Dolores Hart refused the pill and chose a life that suited her better. Others remain products of the system, brilliant cases in a study about what the business of show could do. In the end, these tales are less about individual failure and more about the economy of glamour. The camera flatters, editing lies, and marketing convinces. For a certain era of Hollywood, those tools were enough to transform empty performance into enduring myth. If you watch those old films with new ears, you'll hear the seams, the cutaways, the reaction shots, the moments that can't quite hold. But you'll also see why audiences kept buying tickets, because the industry was selling not truth, but desire. And as long as desire sold, the machine ran.